Hello and welcome to Taliesin's map. And this is a continuation of a live stream I was doing yesterday about the topic of Enda, this mysterious name Enda that appears in the genealogies of the Celtic gods, and specifically at what I think is demonstrably the apex, the final highest name if you trace back the lineage of the Tuatha themselves, who are the main deities of the Gaels, right? And so to begin with, it should be clear that this is building on a lot of material. So for anyone who is just popping in, just joining, this assumes a lot of other things that I've discussed and argued in previous streams and previous articles and the like. So just take that for what it is, and feel free to see where this goes. But basically, when you establish, where the Celtic absolute is in these two different instances, the story of Breogan and his tower, and the story of the beginning of the lineage of the Tuatha. These are two separate strands. The beginning of the lineage of the Tuatha ends, or its first name, the oldest name is Enda, meaning the bird-like, and the name that appears right before Breogan, the absolute name, the name that appears immediately before him is Ein, E-N, meaning bird. So why is the bird-like, or the bird, what you find prior, the name under, when you flip over the name of the absolute, when you turn it over, right underlying it is the bird-like, Enda or Ein, right? Okay, so I think we have to explore and speculate and think about what this means, because I think these two different instances, these two different traditions within the Gaelic material are telling us that this is the highest principle of the absolute, the inherent nature of the absolute, and is an extremely important name that we need to try to understand, right? Okay, so with that, there were some other points I wanted to go into that I wasn't able to cover in the stream yesterday. And so, let's see where we can take this. I want to go back into Rig Veda 1.164, verse 20, if we can here. So let's open that up. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. So this is that verse, and as we were discussing yesterday, it says, two birds associated together and mutual friends take refuge in the same tree. One of them eats the sweet fruit, or the sweet fig. The other, abstaining from food, merely looks on. Okay, and in the Jameson and Brereton translation, they say that the two birds, yoke mates, are in the same tree. They call them, not just associated together. They use the word yoke mates to describe that. So they are more like bound together in some sense. And as you can see here, the commentary, this is sort of the traditional commentary by Sayana, says two birds associated together, the vital and supreme spirit, Jivatma, and Paramatma, are here alluded to using the metaphor of the two birds. Eats the sweet fig, Pipalam, Svadu Ati, the vital spirit enjoys the rewards of acts, etc. Two species of souls to be intended as abiding in one body, according to Nirukta. Okay, so this is like higher and lower levels of the soul, Supreme Spirit versus the Paramatma in Sayana's version here. So the Supreme Spirit is the Supreme Reality itself. Okay, that's what we have when we click here. The absolute self-existent, self-luminous spirit spoken of by various names. And then the Paramatma is the Supreme Soul. So we think of, the word Atman equals Brahman. This is the Atman that equals Brahman, right? The Supreme Soul of the universe, which is born within individuals, as well as a continuation of that Atman. The realization of the nature of ultimate reality may again be a twofold nature: abstract as this is from the encyclopedia. Abstract, i.e., as Brahman, and concrete, i.e., as personal God or the Supreme Soul, Paramatman. In the latter case, the richness of the concrete realization is further increased when one learns to realize God in all his diverse forms. Okay, so the point is, this is similar to what Shankaracharya also says in his commentary, where he just says that the bird who is abstaining from food is the Brahman, and the bird who is eating the sweet fig is the Atman. So that the bird abstaining from food, that is, he is embodying that desireless quality of the absolute, which is also in Atharva Veda 10.8. This Brahman and this Brahman and the Atman that are sort of being identified in that hymn are said to be desireless and to be contented with the essence. And then Trevulniv Treoker of the Gaelic mythology is shown, that's acted out. He acts that quality out. He is this Brahman, but he is shown to be carrying this branch of fruits that he doesn't eat, that he lives off the aroma, just smelling the aroma of the fruits, while he gives out the seeds to be planted as the trees of the world, as the Bila trees of Ireland. And so this is sort of that quality that we see here. So from here, we can see that the Birdlike has these several different possible meanings or readings or interpretations. Like, we want to know, what are they really getting at when they say the Birdlike is this underlying highest description of the quality of the Gaelic absolute itself? Why is Enda right before Tavarn, the primordial ocean, and Tat, who seem more like the face of the absolute, perhaps? Or why is Ain, the bird, the name immediately before Breochan of the tower, who is like the Brahman itself? Why is Ain this underlying quality, right? So obviously, from what we've looked at, there are a few possible meanings of this that we can, that makes sense to me. There's a lot of leeway and openness to other interpretations that could be brought into this, I think. But first and foremost, we have this concept of that which is kind of free, like a sort of freedom from limitations and being bound by things like desires, and being bound by determinations, distinctions that are worldly, because it is the principle of distinction, is not bound by that. Therefore, it's free like a bird. There is, as this Rig Veda hymn describes, it is this bird who's abstaining from the food is witnessing, is looking on, keeping watch, as the Jameson and Brereton version says. And so that implies a concept of being sort of the witness subject in a way, somehow just the watcher that is within the ultimate subject of the absolute, in some sense, right? That would sort of imply the bird's eye view. So the bird could imply the bird's eye view that the absolute has. The other thing that I went into last time is the sort of self-determining power, so that the bird implies the ultimate power, as well as just like these freedoms and what have you. It also implies what is the quality of the ultimate power itself, because that which is the highest concept, the highest absolute. There's nothing beyond it, above it, that determines it. Therefore, it is the determining power, and it is even self-determining in some mystical way, sva daya. And in that sense, that is the description of power itself, in a way. That is a description of the true power. The true power. This is how it is. This is how it has to be described, I guess you could say, mystically. So that in that sense, the bird is power. This comes through, I think, in Svadhyaya that I went into. The Rig Vedic description of the Skamba pillar is Svadhyaya, self-determining power, and then this gets described as a Svatantriya and Svachanda in Shaivite tradition, where Svachanda is like self-will power in some sense. So it's like a willing, nothing outside of it wills what it is going to do or be. It is the source of that. So in that sense, it can be described as a will, at least from one metaphorical perspective. And I think this is interesting because even Plotinus describes the one, the absolute, as something that he feels compelled to describe as a will. That not that it has a will, but that it is a will, and that its will is identical with its existence. And he says that this is sort of imperfect language to describe it, but because of conviction, he feels compelled to use that figure of speech to describe it, because it's this exact same concept where it has to be the source of any determination of itself, and that is indistinguishable in our language from the concept of being a will force of some kind, and that is identical with its existence. So anyways, that's in the Enneads, and I'm trying to remember exactly where that is, but it's not that important. This is a famous passage in Plotinus, which becomes one of the main foundational texts, influences on what develops into will philosophy in other places. Will philosophy. If you take Plotinus and you, along with some of Aristotle, and other sorts of considerations, that develops into will philosophy. But that's interesting to me because you have that there in these underlying Indian concepts of Svadhyaya, which turns into Svachanda, the absolute being this unconditioned will, which must be the determining factor of its own self, even though it's not technically a thing. And this is where the mystical language both fails and philosophers are compelled to use these metaphorical figurations of how this works. So I think that could be part of what is being described of the bird-like is this Svachanda nature, if it's consistent with the Indian material. And let's see. So I think that's interesting because we do have Svachanda Bhairava in the Shaivite tradition, the supreme, fiercely independent manifestation of Lord Shiva. Okay, you can see that Svachanda Bhairava is being held up by, I think, Sada Shiva, a lower form of Shiva, and the supreme form. This is the supreme form in Kashmir Shaivism, and the red deity underneath is Sada Shiva, as you can see. So it's interesting then that this is the highest conception and description of the absolute for esoteric Shaivism, that it is this self will, self determining will. And that's kind of what you have with Svadhyaya. That's what you have with Plotinus saying that the absolute, at least figuratively, is identical with being a will in this paradoxical sense. So there could be something consistent there in an Indo-European, in the Indo-European esoteric understanding that is coming through in the Birdlike, I think. This thing that is free from outside determinations, that is this spontaneous power, that is a description of the quality and nature of that absolute. Okay, so what else do we have? Svachanda Bhairava. Let's see what the encyclopedias say. One of the 7 Bhairavas. Okay. Form of Bhairava. I'd like to get a really good description. So Achanda refers to one's own will. And then Bhairavi, the female form of Bhairava, is called Icha Shakti, the will power. And she moves toward union with one's own will. Having celebrated this form, the mantra thinks of her as Agareshi. In all tantras, this is taught as secret. It is not made clear. Okay. One who is free. So this quality of freedom of the absolute, it just seems well suited to the image of the birdlike, that which shimmers spontaneously, and all of that. So you could think of this self-will quality of the absolute, self-determination, this bird's eye view, seeing, being the awareness of the totality, and being that bird who is also desireless, cut off from externalities, not requiring anything external, as Saint Enda does not have external fire, and shows that sort of that inner power, inner strength. Everything is, the strength is all internal to this absolute, because there's nothing outside of it which gives it strength except its own self. So here's a nice picture of a bird, which is not actually relevant to what we're talking about, but coincidental. Okay. Freely wandering about like a madman. So that's actually quite interesting, because the birdlike connects specifically to Irish texts about the madmen of the wilds, such as Sweeney the Wild. And that's something I wanted to talk about today. So this is a nice sort of foreshadowing of that. So Chanda refers to freely wandering about like a madman, an ancient text on spirituality. Realizing my supreme self-nature in the person of the witness, the Lord, and the state of desirelessness, in bondage or liberation, I feel no inclination for liberation. The various states of one who is empty of uncertainty within, and who outwardly wanders about as he pleases, Svachanda Karen, like a madman, can only be known by someone in the same condition. I think arguably, if we look at the Irish material, something of what that just said is pertinent to the birdlike. And that is mystically describing the underlying nature of the absolute itself. And so this comes back to the picture that Shaivites have of the absolute, which is sort of Shiva and Shakti in union at the highest level. That's Shiva and his female consort Shakti in union, and really you're supposed to understand that they are one and the same, sort of mentally, mystically perceived from two sides somehow. and Shakti is the power. Shiva is the consciousness nature in some sense. Shiva is the prakasha light. Shakti is the vimarsha reflective capacity, um, self-reflective capacity in some sense. But yeah, there's this sort of description of this union of them, and then at a deeper level to describe that union and the totality of them together as Svachanda Bhairava or different conceptions. There are also versions where Kali or Shakti, the feminine side, is foregrounded as the name of the totality. Okay, so it depends on what sect. But in any case, there is this concept of the Leela of the ultimate Svachanda Bhairava or the ultimate Shiva, is characterized by Leela, which means play, divine play. So there's this idea that because the absolute is utterly free, what it is doing is can, metaphorically, poetically be described as play in some sense, because of these reasons that we're going into, it is not compelled, determined from something external. So it has this strange, hard to understand quality of spontaneity, and that comes through in the concept of Leela. That comes through in the concept of the madman. So you can picture, this the image of Shiva dancing and carrying out his dance that generates the cosmos. That is his Leela. That is pertinent to that underlying quality of the Svachanda, and possibly to what the Birdlike is. It's showing this quality that can be related to the concept of play, of Leela, perhaps. I think that is also possibly pertinent to Ptah, who I went into yesterday, because Ptah is he's wrapped in mummy cloth, but his hands are actually free. It's like he's bound, but actually free. And in that sense, and his binding himself in mummy cloth is like he's dying from his state of perfection. He's sort of dying into the world to become born as the essence of everything. And from that perspective, because it's like he's not really dead. In that sense, it's a game. It appears with the character of a game that he's playing, because his hands are actually free. And in that sense, it's almost like the image that comes to mind for me is like Houdini binding himself up in the straitjacket or enclosing himself in the cage or whatever it is, but he actually, is the one in control of the situation, who will release himself, and he's the master escape artist, and that is a sort of play. So from that perspective, you can see Ptah embodying a quality of play that could be described that way, of course, right? Not that that's the only way you can describe that at all, but that's sort of one quality suggested there, that there's some of this sort of paradox about self-determination, and why is Ptah a mummy at this level. The mummy cloth is like the material world, perhaps the prakriti, just as the noon is his body. The noon is like the indefinite feminine aspect, and it wraps him. He's bound. He binds himself in a sense, because there's no one outside of him to bind him. He is the self binder, but he's holding the power of the Jed at the same time. So all of this stuff is kind of pertinent. Different images, I think, for similar, not exactly identical, but similar mystical conceptions about the absolute. Now, from there, as I mentioned last time, I think the Egyptian material, is very interesting in this context, on a couple different levels. First of all, Ptah is kind of the easiest to approach, I think, in this respect, for the reasons I described. He's paired with the noon, the waters, the primordial ocean, in a hyphenated form, so that they are two sides of one, but really they're supposed to be seen as one thing. In a similar way that Shiva is paired with Shakti as Shiva Shakti. Shakti is like the indefinite dyad, the feminine side, similar to the waters. And There's the controlling sort of consciousness male pillar aspect, which is Ptah or Shiva. I think those are very similar concepts of an absolute, really. Um, when you look at him from a certain angle. But nothing about Ptah is the bird-like per se. Except he has these qualities that can be compared to qualities of play and qualities of absolute power and freedom in a paradoxical sense that we've said. But he's not a bird. He's not a bird. There could be versions where there's bird imagery connected to him that I don't know about. Obviously, he's primarily a mummy. So anyone can investigate that. But the Egyptians do have a more well-known bird deity who's placed in the position of the absolute creator, and that is Thoth, Tot. And so I think it's interesting to look at it from this perspective of the different centers of Egypt, the different cities that have their competing or just variant creation myths. And this is a well-known feature of Egypt, that there are multiple different creation myths with different gods and different stories about the creation. The Ptah Nun one is a certain is from a certain center, and the Thoth one is a separate one. So you can see here the Memphite, the Memphis cosmology is the Ptah Nun one, and so Ptah and Nun are merged. Ptah Nun transcends self-creation by mentally conceiving the cosmos and speaking everything into existence. Okay, and then Thoth has his own, and I think this is the Hermopolite, the Hermopolis cosmogony. Let's see. So the patron god Thoth created the cosmos by self-manifesting. So that's connecting to what we're talking about. He self-manifests, speaking the universe into creation or laying a cosmic egg. When Re hatched from the egg, he created everything. Okay. So birthplace of the Ogdoad. But he can be an ibis bird. And this is kind of what I'm talking about. Oh, does this work? Okay. Anyways, that wasn't a very helpful website, but of course, here's Thoth with his name. Means he like the ibis. He's like the ibis. That's also interesting. The point is, he is this sort of creator with a bird nature, right? And this is interesting because it warrants investigation whether this is saying something similar to the bird-like nature that underlies even Breokan. So you could theoretically say Breokan is very similar to Ptah as sort of the face of the absolute, or the certain type of the absolute as craftsman builder, because Ptah and Breokan have this similarity where they are the lords of the sort of column, pillar, tower, and they are both builders. They embody that quality. But then, as an alternate esoteric version of the creation, we have the bird-like, the Thoth, the ibis-like. That's interesting because Thoth is more about certain mystical pursuits of knowledge and writing, as well as the sort of psychopompic qualities associated with birds. And let's see what we got here. He's one, self-begotten, self-produced. That, of course, like I said, self-determination is what the Vedic absolute is, Svadhyaya. That is it's not identical, but it's similar to the concept of self-begotten that is attached to Thoth. And then, of course, he's the inventor of all these science, mathematics, geometry, surveying. It's interesting because, surveying and geometry and things like that, those are what Trevolniev, as the lord of the distinctions, sort of the measurement, the one who brings the measurements to Tara, or the divisions to Tara, and as we saw, Duvnal or Dunval Moelmud, okay, of the Welsh. He is the inventor of the measurement standards, the standards of measurement that became, they were named after him and became the standard in Wales or Britain there. And so that's interesting. That's consistent in a sense. The one who is beyond distinctions is the Lord who invents and makes possible distinctions, so that can be connected. And then, of course, just wisdom and magic. Wisdom and magic, we can see how much the bird-like is really an image of the sort of power of magic, the pure, the shamanic, druidic mystic who masters powers of prophecy, powers of any type of magical act, because they're like the shaman who has climbed the world tree to its height and become like a bird in that sense. Okay, this is sort of a very, very common mystical trope worldwide in anywhere you go. And so that could connect, does the bird like really strongly emphasize the magical power that is gained and controlled by the druid who wears the bird cloak that we went into in the last stream. So god of wisdom, magic, measurement and regulation, events and of time. So it's very similar. It's very similar to what we're thinking of here. Okay. I wanted to see if there's anything to do with, the Ba and the psychopompic connections of Thoth. That would be interesting to see, but then again, it may not all be kind of right here. So I think it's interesting to bring up Thoth, of course, because Thoth is repeatedly compared to Hermes or Mercury, or identified with them. And we've gone into before how the Mercury / Hermes type, well, first of all, there's an issue, sort of unknown. I think one of the comparative mythology conundrums is whether they were actually originally the same deity, or if the Roman Mercury was a slightly different type that was overlaid with Mercury stuff and they got kind of conflated or made more similar than they originally were. But it's not that vital to pin that down at the moment, because from either direction, they could kind of be seen as aspects or reflections of the higher, like Rudra type, as we went into. Hermes is like the Gandharva type, and the Gandharva is like the court bard who embodies eloquence, much like Bragi in the Norse. And then Odin is kind of like the higher Bragi in a sense. You could argue from certain points that I went into in my Mercury video, where it's like there is this individualized Gandharva type. And then there's like Rudra, who it seems pretty clear he's higher than the Gandharvas. But the Gandharvas are sort of focalizations of the bardic power. And that's kind of like what Hermes is. But he is not he's obviously, Hermes, I don't think you can identify with the absolute itself on the highest level. And I think the Rudra type is sort of a higher god than Hermes, most likely. And similar with Mercury, you have these issues where Mercury is either the Gandharva, or perhaps Mercury could have been like a Pan type originally that was conflated with the Gandharva type. Those are a couple of possibilities. But the Pan type, as we go into elsewhere, is really an aspect of the Rudra type, at least in European branches. In the Celtic, Cian is also named Finn MacKinnelly. So Cian, his alternate name is Finn. Finn is the Rudra. Cian is the Pushanic name. And Odin just is both. They just simplify it by making Odin do both the myths connected to both the Pushanic type and, of course, his own Rudraic, Odinic myths. Okay, so the point is, it makes you wonder if Thoth, if you were to compare him to European conceptions, is like the higher Gandharvic nature, but which is not like just the lower Gandharva made into a supreme. It's more like seeing Odin as himself the higher Gandharva, the higher Bragi, and that nature of his, like, it really comes from, like, Bragi's nature really comes from Odin as the higher god of poetry and magic and prophecy and what have you, and eloquence. Odin is that higher source of what Bragi focalizes, and that is that nature, it is that Gandharvic nature, which is bird-like, and of course Odin turns into birds. We know that as well. And so it is that sort of bird-like Gandharvic nature. It's really like, it's like the Hermes embodies that in a really pure image on a lower level, and is, in that chain of beings and powers. He's of that type, but it's like this higher version that is the power underlying the absolute, is a more totalizing concept than what really Hermes himself can do. But they are continuous. It's kind of like what we were saying last time. Like the bird-like is like the psychopomp, or sorry, birds are images of psychopomps a lot of times, and the bird-like quality. But like the psychopomps who are doing the psychopumping on the lower level are not in their individual selves. They are not the absolute, but they are continuous with it coming down. This is played with, as I said, in Rig Veda 1.164, that whole hymn. It's playing with this concept of the essence of the fire, that's this sort of bird-like, and then Agni, and Agni becoming identified with the sun as well. So the sun image is identified with that that bird-like, or that bird in the tree, and that fire. And then later, and then throughout the hymn, there are different points where it says like there are multiple birds, multiple well-feathered ones who are like calling out for sacrificial oblations and things like that. And those are like the individual sacrificial fires throughout the world. So individual instances of the fires are continuous with the higher bird nature, but they are not the totality of the absolute itself, but they are exemplifying that nature. Okay, so that is another thing that is the bird-like, is this the fire itself contains the bird-like quality in some way. Different metaphors can be applied. And then the sun itself. So I do think there is something interesting to be said about how the sun gets used as a primary metaphor of the absolute in Plato. And the sun in Rig Veda 1.164 is being mystically identified with the fire and with the nature of the fire, which is the bird-like of the which is the Brahman. Okay, if that makes sense. That chain of associations is being played with and brought to the forefront, so that it's like the sun is, and this is directly metaphorically stated at some points, that the sun is the bird, or it'll describe the sun being born as this bird or calf, also sometimes a calf, being born. Okay, and so yeah, you can imagine how the sun flying through the sky itself is an example of the bird, like of in the mystical metaphor. It is the great bird of the sky, is the sun. Okay, so these things converge into a point at the absolute, where the absolute is like the sun, which really itself is the bird-like, or is the exemplar, is the outward face of the bird-like nature. That is the inner essence, underlying essence, and that's why it flies through the sky. That is why in Rigveda 4.14.5, it is a hymn to Agni, the fire, but it's describing the sun because the sun is Agni. It's saying, what is that svadaya? What is that self-power by which you fly through the sky without tumbling down? It is the skamba of heaven. It is which is the absolute. So it is that Brahman inside of the fire, which is the sun, and that is its nature is svadaya, which is the bird-like. So you can connect Rigveda 4.14.5 and Rigveda 1.164 as reiterating the same sort of chain of metaphors that lead from the bird-like inner nature to the nature of the fire, which is then the sun, and causes the flight. It causes flight. It upholds the sun and upholds the entire sky. It is like everything is. It is what makes everything fly, and including the sun and everything else in the sky. It is the great. The sun is the great bird and is the great bird-like. It's interesting because this could be like a big divergence between the Egyptian and the Indo-European, because Thoth is identified as a moon god usually. So that's always struck me as strange if what we're talking about is true. And there are a couple different explanations of that. One would be that Thoth really was like a lower Gandharva type or moon god type that was sort of lower, that was elevated to the role of the supreme just as a cultural development and wasn't originally that. Secondly, it could be that because the unmanifest was pictured as like night, like this, it could have just been like the unmanifest absolute it became more consistently pictured as a place of darkness because nothing is born yet. And therefore, what is the great luminary of the darkness of the unmanifest? It's the moon for them. So therefore, in that mystical conception, the moon is really just like the sun of the night almost. So that moon and sun kind of blend together as, what is the great luminary of the darkness, and therefore he's the moon. But mystically, it's like sun and moon kind of blend together, and that happens with other places. It happens with like Dionysus. I think sun and moon kind of come to blend together in certain instances. There are places where, the moon is described like the sun of the night, and there are, of course, like Savitar is the lord of the nighttime sun, and that, like, what that concept, it gets played with, and gets played with in term, like confused with what the moon and stuff sometimes. So that's a possible reading of why Thoth is that. But in any case, he is the great luminary of the night. He's still a lord of the great luminary, and he embodies that. And then, of course, basically the sun then gets born. So it does follow this progression of like the nighttime is the point of beginning, and then the sun gets born and is like a continuation of Thoth in this instance. Okay, so it could be kind of what I'm describing, where it just has to do with a metaphor of the progression of from darkness to light in that sense. Okay, so let's see. There's an image of Mercury as a bird that I wanted to pull up, because Mercury is interesting. Well, first of all, it's interesting that the Gandharvas themselves are occasionally depicted as birds. They are described as birds. They fly. Sometimes they fly on airplane machines that are described in translation as airplane-like things, and other times they'd fly as birds in bird forms and things like that. So that's interesting. They kind of take on that bird form, and that is fitting with what we're talking about with Mercury, Hermes, of course, and Mercury. They have like the winged sandals, but not usually depicted as flying around as a bird fully. But there are sort of like exceptions to that. So let's see, like Mercury is That's not. Okay. Mercury is associated with a rooster, so Herald of Dawn, Guide of Souls, okay, ties back to that. Watchfulness and commerce. So watchfulness, Guide of Souls, these things, once you see these traits repeating enough in various places connected to birds, it starts to sort of give you confidence that we are interpreting what the bird-like meant for the Celts accurately. It pertains to watchfulness, it pertains to Guide of Souls, but it pertains to the freedom, the flight of the birds as well, and all of that. Mercury accompanied by a bird. Okay, so it can serve as his symbol. But there is another place where Mercury bird some things like this, yeah. So in some alchemical things, Mercury gets depicted as a strange bird, so that could be something to think about, although it probably has its own unique reason why he's connected to a bird in that instance, connecting to the vapors, the way the vapors behave in alchemical experiments and that sort of thing. But it's something that's coming through, connected to this power of flight that's associated with his type. So I think it's valid. It can still be esoterically valid, I think. Yeah, I'm going to pull up one other thing because it can be interesting. Okay. This is a nice alchemical Mercury bird. And yeah, so Mercury is the bird-like in that, and he has a crown, that's interesting. So, okay. The description of that says, the Hermes bird, standing amidst the 7 feathers which pierce the waters from which it will be reborn. The solar water which falls in droplets round the bird is a symbol of rebirth or reincarnation, which is the destiny of the phoenix-like bird. And that's from a copy of George Ripley's Alchemical Scroll circa 1470. Right? Okay, very interesting. And tells us how, I think symbols can be reborn in different connections and still be valid in, even though this is a latent alchemical concept that's not really there in the ancient Greek version of Hermes or something. So that's very thought-provoking. Yeah, greetings. Yeah, thank you guys for joining. Thanks for watching. Greetings to everyone who's here. So there's more that I want to touch on. Yeah. I want to bring up Old Norse tradition, nameless eagle. Well, this is exactly, we mentioned this last time. This is exactly right. Hermother and Sigmund are the Gandharvas led by Bragi. That's interesting. That's very interesting. I can't remember if the connection to Sigmund has been explained to me before. But for Hermother, I've always thought it's a good possibility that he's another Gandharva along with Bragi. I've definitely left that possibility open without feeling like it was extremely made definite enough. Like maybe, yeah. But part of me is like, his name is Hermes. It's tempting, or his name is Hermother. It's tempting to call him a Gandharva. But am I being tricked by the name? But there are things about him that seem like he is paired with Bragi and is in these roles where he's in hell in a sort of psychopompic position, and messenger position, sort of something like that. So it's absolutely possible. And yeah, I just know other people have had different readings of him, of course. Okay, so along with that, I wanted to go into the ba and the ka real quickly. So we have this. So I touched on this last time, where the ba is this personality soul. These are the aspects of the soul, and there are some that are sort of more more frequently invoked. I think like the ka and the ba are very frequently invoked. Of course, the ib, the heart, is important and invoked a lot too, but it's not treated as much like what we would think of as the soul per se. The ba and the ka, the personality and the self, the vital essence double, are very, I don't know, it's arguable, but it seems like the ba and the ka are like very strongly what the personal soul is similar to. And as you can see here, the ba is a bird with a human head. Ba takes the form of a bird with a human head. It is everything that's unique. It's like a personality. And it lives on, is depicted as a human-headed bird that flies out of the tomb to join with the ka in the afterlife. So it goes to the afterlife, it flies above. The soul has wings that flies away when you die. So that sort of thing. It's flying upward to join with the ka, I guess. That's interesting. Okay, so the idea of purely immaterial soul was foreign to the Egyptians, though. So you have to think of it in those terms. The word ba meant something like impressiveness, power, and reputation, particular to a deity. So yeah, you frequently will see the ba of Ra, or the ba of whatever deity is in question. The deity acts through his ba in the world, essentially. And that could be like a panther shows up and does some action in the world, and that was the ba of the deity who sort of is manifesting in through that, because the deity themselves was seen as more transcending of the world and then acting through its ba in the world. So that's interesting, right? Okay, but anyways, so it's like the potency of the power of the deity that acts in the world. Then ka is a different one. That's not the bird. That's not really a bird depicted one. This bird here is not really. It's just having to do with the king's little little crown thing there. But the point here is that you then get to the ak, the intellect. Well, okay, intellect. Obviously, intellect is an extremely like reduced definition of what ak means. As you can see, it can also mean the magically effective one. So I think this is why what I've been sort of touching on and building up to is that like magical effectiveness itself. That's kind of like what Thoth was embodying, right? As the absolute one who births himself and is the creator, who is the bird-like creator, and is the god of really magic and wisdom and measurements and all of those things. He's like the ultimately magically effective one, and that bird-like nature shows that symbolically. And that's why the ak is can also be described as, or interpreted, what am I saying? Can also be translated as the magically effective one. And so the ak is this concept of sort of the ultimately transfigured, deified soul of the dead. Not everyone becomes an ak basically after death. And I think even, originally it was more reserved to the pharaohs and perhaps the priests, the high priests. I'm not quite sure, but this sort of becoming an ak was this aspiration of sort of immortality and absolute magical effectiveness that would continue after death. You would become this shining Ak in the Akhet. And it was an aspiration of the pharaoh, but also an expectation. The pharaohs would have themselves ritually led and transformed their souls essentially through ritual into an Ak. So it was an expectation that they would become this Ak, and they would live on as an Ak after their death. So yeah, it's this ultimate concept. In that sense, it can be connected to the ultimate power, which has some relevance to intellect, as we can see, but it's not purely reducible to that. And yeah, we saw that the bird of Rig Veda 1.164, that is the Brahman bird, is the one who is the observer, observing everything. That is like what the concept of intellect is connected to: the awareness, the consciousness, awareness, observation, intellect. So these things converge. The same sorts of concepts that we were talking about: magical efficaciousness, as well as sort of bird-like awareness or intellect. They kind of pop up here, I think, as well. So this could be then, it's like Thoth as the absolute God he is like the ultimate Ak in himself, and he makes possible, he's the ground of possibility of the Akhet itself, where souls can be kind of mystically become like unto him, or united with him as their own bird form Aks, who become the bird nature of the absolute. Okay, this is sort of what it's suggesting. I'm kind of speculatively connecting those things together, riffing a little bit, as you can see, but to try to paint a possibility, to paint a possible comparison here. Identified with light itself. So that's important. That's interesting. It was associated with thought, but not as an action of the mind. Rather, it was intellect as a living entity. That's crucial, obviously, and relevant to Vedic material, because there's this repeated thing where the mind is this lower thing, and the intellect, or a different word like consciousness, is actually the transcendent quality. That's more like pure awareness or something. It's not reducible to mind, or at least there will be like a distinction of levels within what the intellect is. There's like the rational mind is like lower, and then there's like the higher intuitive mind or something like that. And this is in Plato and elsewhere, where those distinctions are made. And in Vedic material, it's very much so that you negate the mind, because it's the lower what we think of as coming as having to do with our brain, and there's a higher awareness, which is like the pure source of intellect perhaps, which is like identified with pure light and things like that, and that is the Brahman nature. That seems relevant. That seems comparable to what we're looking at here, I think. So it is not associated with just simply the mind, or not an action of the mind. Okay, but it is intellect as a living entity. So it's not. It's something more full. It's something more full and living than what is just like mental activity. The Ak also played a role in the afterlife. Following the death of the physical body, the Ba and the Ka were reunited to reanimate the Ak. It's this potentiality, I guess, that is waiting to be reanimated by the lower bird soul, the Ba, which goes to join with the higher bird nature, which is the Ak. The reanimation of the Ak was only possible if the proper funeral rites were executed and followed by constant offerings. And it's like making a dead person into a living Ak. Okay, and there could be roaming Ak, etc. It could be invoked by prayers or written letters. All of this stuff. It's ritual means to cause this transfiguration into the Ak. Okay. It was intended to eliminate the second death. So the second death is like when you die, there was a concept that you would go to an afterlife of somewhere, whether it was an underworld or a heaven. But then there's the concept, as you'll see it in a movie like Coco, if you've seen Coco, where after a while you'll run out of your energy in the afterlife even, and you will die the second death, which is the final death of obliteration. You ultimately become obliterated. Or this was a fear or a possibility in some traditions. It's there in some Vedic material. It is a fear that is, there are certain mystical techniques and different arguments, debates about how to deal with that possibility of the second death and how to reach ultimate liberation. That's sort of the concept of ultimate liberation that reaches absolute immortality. It's there in the Vedic tradition as it develops, at least over time. And I recommend the book Vedic Cosmology and Ethics by Henk Henk Bodowitz, Bodewitz, Henk Bodowitz, and he writes about this, about how there's these different traditions and ideas in Vedic thinking over time in the Brahmanas and texts surrounding that Upanishads, where it seems like there's a development of an increased anxiety about dying the second death over time, which leads to a stronger emphasis on needing to reach pure liberation, pure transcendence, that will be, full immortality. Okay. He traces some of that or makes arguments about that. Okay, so that's the idea with the Ak. It's intended to aid the deceased in not dying a second time. And that just means that if you become an Ak fully, you're supposed to be eternally immortal. You've become one with the absolute. You become one with God or the absolute. You become a shining one, a shining Ak. So, I'm not saying that the Druids, that the Celts, or even the Proto-Indo-Europeans had that exact concept. It's possible to me that they didn't have as much anxiety about the second death. I don't know if they did. Maybe they had levels or just different possibilities of what level you could attain to, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, Henk Bodowitz argues that it was only over time that the real anxiety about dying the second death sort of took over, as like you really have to reach the full liberation or you're just going to die a second death. He makes it seem like earlier on they didn't worry about the second death as much, and that maybe they thought if you just do the normal thing, you'll be fine. You'll reach immortality or whatever they're shooting for, union with some god or transcendence or a heavenly realm, an afterlife that is beneficial, whatever. But in any case, there are these different possibilities, and they could all, and it doesn't mean like the bird-like nature was bound and tied to one of these conceptions of death and the afterlife. The bird-like nature could be there as this ideal goal and power underlying, how the lower soul is united to the higher bird-like nature. It can be there while the conceptions around that and what you're supposed to do and what the goal is can shift and change over time. So the Druids may have had their own way of thinking of this and of what they worried about, what they thought the ultimate goal was. Okay, so we don't want to fully import the Vedic or Egyptian anxieties or concepts about that into the Celtic without evidence that that's what they were thinking. But I do think the underlying idea of this bird-like nature being the description of the quality of the nature of this highest, just the highest nature of the absolute, where the soul can be united to. I think that's probably valid. I think that's a valid possibility of what the bird-like in the Celtic was about, to some degree. Okay, because it's there in a similar way in the Vedic, and it just sort of makes sense of a lot of things. So, okay, let's see. What else? Is there anything else to say about the Ak? Spiritual power, dignity, but also mental faculty skill. So you can see that it's the mental faculty. It is an aspect of this. This quality of the bird-like. It is continuous with mental activity. So that is actually interesting and valid, because Finn is the god of the mental activity and the intellect. Particularly, he's like the intellectual principle, the nous. And so one of our big questions is this absolute, this bird-like quality, is it continuous with Finn in particular, or is it a separate, higher absolute that's more impersonal, and that just encompasses all the gods and not him exclusively? And we're seeing kind of evidence for some of both. I think there are some points where it does seem like they're intersecting, overlapping, and other points where they are separated, where Trevolnydd is separate from Fintan. Trevolnydd is giving the distinctions and the measurements of Tara, the divisions of Tara, to Fintan. Fintan is then like the nous in the world. Trevolnydd is the absolute, who is the source of distinctions. And so it's showing the absolute passing on that ability of that power of distinction to the mind, the cosmic mind, which is Fintan, within the world, to make the distinctions. Okay, so it's showing a division of personalities and of division of roles. And it's just a question whether that is just for the sake of the story, or like, and is Trevolnydd really Fintan's higher own self, because he's the mind, Fintan is the mind of the cosmos, and the absolute is the absolute nature of the cosmos. In that way, they are of course continuous, but are they uniquely identifiable, one with the other, or should we maintain a strict cutoff between them? Okay, so it is just is it valid to treat the absolute in the way that Shaivites do, where they say, okay, Rudra Shiva is within the world as the sort of the consciousness principle, as a god unto himself, a god among other gods. He's reborn from Prajapati, as this specific destroyer god, a liminal outsider god, god of the wild, and all of that. But then they have the concept of Shiva, who transcends, and he's really purely Shiva, or Bhairava, at least Bhairava Shiva. And as that transcendent form, he is the absolute itself. And that, in that sense, they're saying that there's a distinction, of course, of levels, but really Rudra Shiva and the absolute Shiva are continuous in a unique way, where Shiva is like the personality of that absolute. Is that what the Irish version is saying with Finn and the absolute, or not? Has the Shaivite version gone farther than we should say for the Gaelic to identify them? So this is one of these conundrums that we have to just keep looking at everything as much as we can, I think, and comparing. But one moment, please. But with Thoth, I think you can see that you can see how Thoth is a conception, similar to the Gandharva. Gandharva is almost a subtype of the Rudraic type in the West, and so that's an argument for Thoth indeed being sort of similar to the god of the intellect, who is the Rudra type in Indo-European material. That's an Egyptian comparison that can make you think that could be valid, that maybe the bird-like is continuous in this way. Similar even with Ptah. Ptah is this god who has qualities that remind us of Shiva. Ptah Nun is similar to Shiva Shakti. Ptah binding himself like Houdini and being wrapped in a mummy cloth. It's similar to Shiva covered in the cremation ash. So it's the material of the death cult. Shiva's covered in that. He's white with the cremation ash. Ptah is wrapped in the mummy cloth. It's comparable in their various different societies, and then Shiva has the play of entering the world through his play. Ptah is doing similar. Okay, so what am I saying with that is that there's arguments where it's hard to disentangle the god of the intellect from the god of the bird nature or the god of the absolute in some ways, at least from a certain perspective. Okay, and does that stay consistent in Indo-European and in Celtic material? Let's look at some of the Irish texts that might have a bearing on this issue. So last time we pulled up the story of the Cora, and I'm gonna find this very quickly. It's because we went into the story of Saint Enda of Erin, and that told us we can glean some details, some possible details about what this Enda type is. But there's a second most pertinent story about the name, someone with the name Enda, and that is the story of the voyage, the sea voyage, sea paddling, of the paddling about of Ena and his two brothers that we touched on last time. Just trying to find the link here real quickly. Here it is. So we showed how there's these three brothers, Ena, Enne, and then Lochan, Lochan, and Sylvester. And there are these three brothers who go on a sea voyage. One of them is named Enne, and this is probably, it seems most likely to be just a alternate spelling of Eanna, or these different variations of Ena, Enda, all coming from the root word, which is en, meaning bird. So that would suggest that this could be more valid material telling us about Enda, right? So that's the point. Now, what's interesting is that I touched on last time how Sylvester, the brother, it's basically a cognate name with Widucus or Gwydion, because it means dweller in the woods, dweller of the woods. So just show Sylvester means woodland dweller of the woods. Well, Widucus means of the woods. So I'm thinking maybe the original Gaelic name was just Gwydion, a Irish version of Gwydion, of course, and that they Latinized it. They Latinized it to Sylvester, probably. This is one possibility. And then, of course, Lochan. It appears to come from this word for Loch. It's last time I kept saying Lock when it's Loch. If anyone caught that, so Loch, and that of course can mean lake, but I don't think this guy means little lake. It's most likely that it is with the accent bright. So there's a bunch of different options. It just makes sense that. Well, okay, there's an article on Enda and Lochan, and he argues that they're in the variant spellings of Lochan in certain place names, especially. It has to be coming from the word for light, because it's spelled like with Lu and L, all these variations that you see as Luache, Luacha, things like this, which suggest that it means the light one. And let me see here. So Saint Finbar of Cork. Okay, that's interesting. Saint Finbar of Cork. Finbar of Cork. Is he the one? He's born with the name Lochan. And you can see the accents there are more clear. The accent on the O. that is what we were looking at with the word meaning lok. Okay, so that's kind of just evidence that lokon actually, in its proper spelling, has the accent on the O, and it means bright or splendor. That's pertinent to what we were just discussing, where the birdlike, the whatever, what have you, the ak, it pertains to pure light, some kind of quality of light. But this is also interesting because Finbar is the saint, and his birth name is Lokon. So that implies that maybe Lokon is just another name of Finbar. And of course, Finbar has the name Fionn in it. So then that brings up the question of whether Lokon is a form of Finn. One scholar has theorized that this Finbar is identical with Finian also. So is Finian also is Finian Lokon? That's kind of like a lingering question, and yeah, so I think that's just something that has to be kind of left open as we investigate. But it would be interesting because Sylvester is a Gwydion Cian name, and Cian is called Finn. Are these different aspects connecting back to Finn or not? It's the same question that we're raising, and now that's interesting based on what they do in the story. So let me answer a couple questions before I move on, because I'd like to involve you guys. I'm trying to make my way through this swamp of material. But yeah, is Garuda bird similar to Thoth? This is a really good question. I can't seem to make it make sense that he would be that high of a conception. Like, there's nothing where Vishnu rides on Garuda, so he's not really like the highest nature of anything. He's just like a mount. There are some rare instances where Garuda is identified with Shiva as well. So that's maybe there's some remnant there of something that connects in that sense. Other places I know, like Garuda is a symbol of the soul, the Atman, not the higher Brahman itself. Okay, so maybe like the bird that is eating the fruit in Rig Veda 164 is more comparable to Garuda. But this gets back to the question of, like, there is the highest bird-like nature, the nature of the birds, and then there's like the king of the birds within the world. And the king of the birds within the world doesn't have to be that highest transcendent nature. Okay, even Garuda himself, he might be a lower manifestation of this bird nature. So that's kind of where you have to like ask that question. So I would leave that question open. It's just hard for me to say like Garuda is the Brahman itself, and even like the underlying nature of the Brahman. It seems more to me like logically makes sense that the underlying nature of the Brahman is what manifests as Garuda on his particular level, whatever level different traditions will treat that as. Okay, so it's just like sort of like an open question. And this is relevant to Nevgan. So you're asking about Nevgan, which this is another one I want to touch on. Nevgan is also described as, Garuda is like the king of the birds. Nevgan is this Irish figure who's said to be the king of the birds, or at least the king of the king, or the king of the king's birds, or something like that. We'll look at the text if we can. So Nevgan might be similar to Garuda as this sort of lower manifestation of the king of the birds, or if he's the king of the birds, he might just be an image of that highest bird nature. And you can't really know unless there's a clear evidence for one or the other, right? So we can kind of like discuss that and see what you guys think. Anubis, I think Anubis is more like Bhairava within the world, or Rudra within the world, something like that, because Anubis does what Sharabha does when Sharabha skins Narasimha. Anubis, this dog god, whatever, he skins Set in the form of a leopard, or a panther or something, but I think it's a leopard. So a sort of powerful cat, a great cat, whatever, a leopard instead of a lion, and Set is equivalent to Narasimha mythologically. So when Set takes his leopard form I think he's going to attack Osiris, Anubis intervenes and skins him, and then the priests of Anubis wear the leopard skin as, signs of being Anubis priests thereafter, recalling this myth. And Shiva wears the whatever he wears the pelts in different instances, as you can kind of look that up as well. So there's an image of Shiva with the Shiva with, I just don't want to misspeak of which types of pelts he's wearing, because there is a point where Sharabha wears the skin of Narasimha that he just skinned, but then there's images of Shiva wearing a tiger skin or an elephant skin, or a spotted. I mean, that's clearly not a tiger. It looks like a spotted leopard or something, but maybe it's a tiger. Okay. In any case, you can look it up and see whether it's a tiger or leopard skin that Shiva is usually wearing. But then in the Sharabha myth, he skins the lion Narasimha and wears that, at least at that point in the story. Okay, this doesn't, those are kind of separate but similar. Yeah, those are good questions. So yeah, I think this issue, it's pertinent about these levels within the Rudra type, right? Anubis is this lower level. Sometimes looking at the Egyptian stuff, it's like a lot of the different gods have connections you can make to the different levels of Rudra Shiva, which makes sense since Rudra Shiva has so many aspects. And in the Egyptian material, there's not always connections between those gods, making that clear. But sometimes there are. Sometimes there are mystical. I can't think of them right now, but some of these ones are tied together. Like, for example, Shu is the god of like the etheric air or something like that, or space. And he's the one who divides earth and sky, Geb and Nut. And that is the sort of Rudra of the world role. So Shu obviously has a pertinence to that role. But then Anubis, in his more Bhairava Sharabha role, also does. And then, like I said, Ptah as the absolute has some similar qualities to Shiva as the absolute, I think. And then Thoth as the absolute might have pertinence to this bird-like quality, which we're trying to figure out whether that applies validly to the Rudra Shiva type, or if it's a higher underlying quality of everything. Okay, so yeah, these are great questions. Okay, so from there, I wanted to keep reading this stuff about Finian and Finbar. These are like fascinating little questions about who are Ena's two brothers that are his companions. One of them is Sylvester, which is essentially apparently like Kian, and one of them is Lokhan, which essentially means bright or splendor, and then he himself is Enda, and of course, like Enda is the quintessential monk who is shaven-headed and has the fire within him, figuratively speaking. And so as the monk, it's hard to disconnect that image really from Finn in some ways, from the Finn type, who is the intellectual principle, because Finn becomes shaven-headed like a monk when he is stricken with a disease as a boy, and he is the one who creates the tree that is fasted under to gain prophecy. The prophetic power then references back to this ultimate power. Okay, so there's a definite like channel, a definite cycle that connects these two types. So the question is, are they one and the same, or should we keep a strict line between them? But if Aina has these two brothers, one of them might be like a Kian, Finn McKinley type. One of them is like a god or a figure named essentially like light, but Lokon then is the birth name of another saint named Finbar. Does that mean Lokon is another aspect of Finn? And then if both of the brothers were Finn types, it would suggest that Aina himself is strongly connected to that power, at very least, if not himself, just a third name of the higher Finn. Okay, so that's what's unknown. As it says here, unknown. This is unknown, but we're exploring it. So what's fascinating about this separate story of Aina that I really wanted to get to is that what they do is they take part in this mytheme that is found throughout the Irish material in multiple places, actually, in a couple different places. But really, let's try to name them real quick. It is this mytheme about voyaging through the ocean, usually, and coming upon some sort of pillar or island, or pillar with an island on top, things like that, or tower at sea. And like sometimes in some of these versions, like this one, essentially the top and bottom are sort of can't be seen, and yeah, there's a question about what is this great tower and what and certain things, an encounter with a tower or pillar at sea. And this mytheme reminds of when Brahma and Vishnu encounter the pillar with the linga in it, essentially the linga pillar, which is Shiva's transcendent form. The absolute itself is the pillar, symbolically, and it is the story of Shiva being the absolute as the pillar, which is the whole question we're looking at. Is Shiva, is the Shiva type also that way in the Gaelic material? But so it's like the encounter with the pillar where the top and bottom are stretching off into out of sight, and wondering what is this thing, this great wonder that they encounter. And what's interesting is that, yeah, it's Vishnu and Brahma sort of like the competing other aspects of the absolute in the Trimurti, in the Indian tradition, who have the encounter with the pillar. But in this version, at least, with Aina, it is Aina himself. Aina is the name of the underlying nature of the absolute, as we've seen, or it's at least it's the name at the summit of the genealogies of Brochan and the Tuatha. And so Enda or Aina really should be the absolute itself. He's the name of the absolute, of its fundamental nature, I think. And so it's strange that he's the one encountering the pillar in this moment of awe. So, it could just be a different way they treated it, but it is interesting, something to think about. Because is it like, is it the absolute reflecting on its own self? Is it, is it Aina? Is it the nature of the absolute encountering his pillar? Is it Aina encountering Briochan? Something like that, or what is, what does this mean? First of all, how can we make sense of it? Is it saying a similar thing to the Vedic one or not? So let's read a little bit about this story. But first of all, this is, like I said, this is a trope or a motif within Irish tradition. It shows up in this story of the voyage of the E Cora, and it's one of these sort of sea voyaging stories. But it also shows up in the voyage of Maelduin. Okay, see this Maelduin right here? This story references that one at the end. It says, Maelduin beheld this same thing, because there's a separate story of the voyage of Maelduin, and he encounters this same silver pillar at sea. And so because of that, we can read those two stories side by side and see that they're probably from an original source, and you can get different details from both of them. So that's nice. Maelduin is sort of in the exact role of Aina, so that's interesting. It makes you wonder if Maelduin is another name of Enda even. Moel means bald, just like Dunwall, Dunval, Moelmud. So it's the same word in Dunval, Moelmud, the Welsh version. You got Maelduin. Okay, so it's up in the air whether that's the same, but you have two versions of the story at least. Okay, so you have those versions, and then the pursuit of the Gila de Care and his horse, I believe it's called. There's a version there where Finn and his men, including Diarmid, they're chasing. I forget his name right now. They're chasing a trickster sort of deity who has run off with a bunch of Finn's men on his horse, and they go over some of the ocean, and they encounter this rock wall in the ocean, so to speak, or some kind of island. And it's so high they can't scale it, and then Diarmid leaps up with his spear and does scale it up to the top, and the rest of the crew has to go a different way and join them eventually. Okay, but so that's sort of like a similar thing. And I think even the voyage of, what is it? Voyage of Brendan or Voyage of Bran. There's another version. Anyways, there's another version with a similar thing. I won't go too much into that. The point is, it's a repeated sort of trope. The two kind of main ones I want to look at are Voyage of Ikora with Aina himself, and then the Voyage of Moel Duin, which is like the same story, but with some more details that we can think about. So it says, thereafter it was shown to them on the second day a marvelous thing on the sea, a thing more wondrous than aught else. So it's more wondrous than anything else. And this is in a story of seeing wonder after wonder as they're voyaging around crazy things. And this is more wondrous than aught else, namely a great pillar, silvern and four-cornered. Four-cornered. That's interesting because the stone of Trevolnid is three-edged, not four. Three-edged. Okay, so yeah, something to think about. Silvern and four-cornered in the midst of the sea, and a fishing net drawn from its summit into the deep. And so I need to double check this, but I think the word for fishing net, it's not really like fishing net. I think it might be more like covering, some kind of more generic covering thing, drawn from its summit into the deep. Of silver, moreover, and white bronze was that net. Lokon put a mesh of that net, wherein were 3 half ounces of silver and of white bronze. For a token of this tale, he put the mesh aside, and Moel Duin beheld the same thing. Okay, so they see a giant silvern, wondrous, great mighty pillar with its summit in the deep. Oh no, from the summit, a fishing net from its summit into the deep. And they cut off a piece. One of the crew cuts off a piece of the mesh to save as a token of this happening. But it's interesting that it has this mesh, some kind of mesh, quote unquote fishing net. But I think this could potentially be comparable to even the veil. Remember that Trevolnith Treoker. Trevolnith means the triple support, just as if he himself is the pillar, I would say, arguably. And then Treoker is the 3 edges. He has 3 edges instead of 4. I don't know what that discrepancy means. Maybe it means something more significant. But he's wearing a veil. Trevolnith Treoker is wearing a veil. This is why I say that veil is to shield the splendor of the absolute, but it's also symbolically the wall in between human perception and the absolute, which is like the veil of ignorance. So I think it's possible that this covering, this mesh rather, that they're describing like a net, is like the veil of ignorance, perhaps, of a covering. I don't know for sure. You also, of course, have like on the Skamba pillar in the Atharva Veda, there are 2 female deities who are described as weaving with their shuttles. They're weaving something from like hanging off of the pillar itself. It seems like they have their shuttles there on the Skamba, and they're doing the weaving. It seems like they could be day and night, or they could be fate sisters or something like that. But it seems like they're possibly day and night, the goddesses, weaving something off of. So there's a weaving happening from off of the pillar there. This is a mesh hanging off of there. So because of that, it makes me, you have Plato's Republic. And in Plato's Republic, if you look at necessity or ananke toward the end in the myth of section, myth of er, we have this. Okay. We have column. There's a column. They encounter a column here. On the 8th day, the souls of the pilgrims resumed their journey, and in 4 days came to. So they're on a journey. This myth of air. It's the fact that they're journeying around, seeing this. That already reminds of these voyage stories, like the voyage of the Ikora, seeing all these strange wonders. Not that they're identical, but like you can kind of maybe imagine an original source type of story of a journey that gets taken in different directions, maybe. Came to a spot where they looked down upon a line of light. So it's light, what they see, a line of light in color like a rainbow, only brighter and clearer. One day more brought them to the one day more brought them to the place, and they saw that this was the column of light which binds together the whole universe. This is obviously the skamba of heaven, the column of light which binds together the whole universe, the axis mundi. The ends of the column were fastened to heaven, and from them hung the distaff of necessity, that's ananke, on which all the heavenly bodies turned. The hook and spindle were of adamant, and the whorl was of a mixed substance. The whorl was in form like a number of boxes fitting into one another with their edges turned upward, making together a single whorl, which was pierced by the spindle. Okay. So yeah, you have different discs, different the whorl and the spindle are obviously referencing a weaving that is happening as if of fabric, although the fabric itself isn't necessarily described, but the sort of whirl and the machinery of this that's hanging off of this distaff is described like these the spheres that are sort of revolving in the outermost rim. So see, they're making together a single whorl, which is pierced by the spindle. The outermost had the rim broadest, and the inner whorls were smaller and smaller and had their rims narrower. And you have the planets hanging on them, and then you have the Fate sisters, the daughters of necessity, sat on thrones at equal intervals, and they're singing past, present, and future. Clotho, from time to time, guiding the outer circle with a touch of her right hand, Atropos with her left hand touching and guiding the inner circles. Lachesis, in turn, putting forth her hand from time to time to guide both of them. Okay, and let's see. Yeah, the point is they're weaving something off of this pillar of light, which is the pillar of the universe. That reminds of, is this fishing net of Enda perhaps a similar thing? Because I think the Gaelic word needs to be sort of investigated a bit more. I think it might be a more generic kind of fabric thing that's being interpreted that way. And even if let's say it's a fishing net, does that suggest something about, the cycle of the cosmos is conceived as mystically as food. Sometimes the cycle of food going the source of everything is the summit of the absolute, and it goes down and then goes back up in a cycle. Like, is there a fishing metaphor of that, or are the fish related to souls? The souls of humans are fish in a Gaelic conception. Sometimes the cattle of Tethra, the ocean, are believed to be referring to like the souls in the underworld, are like fish in that sense, or something like that. Okay, so I could be misremembering that detail, but these are images you could consider with that. So if you go to, okay, I want to pull up the voyage of Mael Dwin is my next my next venture here. Okay. Cool. So is that showing up? Yes. All right. So the Voyage of Moel Duin is a variation of the Enda story that we just saw. And it says, he goes to all these different places. And finally, there is a great column of silver with a silver net, and part of which one of them takes back as well. But what's interesting is on this one, a voice is heard on the summit that's speaking an unknown language. And then right after that one, they see an island that's standing high up on a single pedestal, which is a similar vision that or encounter that they have back to back. So that's curious. But if we go to this one in particular, we can read, thereafter they voyaged until they found a great silvern column. It had 4 sides, and the width of each of these sides was 2 oar strokes of the boat, so that in its whole circumference there were 8 oar strokes of the boat, and not a single sod of earth was about it, but only the boundless ocean. And they saw not how its base was below, or because of its height, how its summit was above. Out of its summit came a silvern net, far away from it, and the boat went under sail through a mesh of that net. And Diuron gave a blow of the edge of his spear over the mesh. Destroy not the net, saith Moel Duin, for what we see is the work of mighty men. For the praise of God's name, saith Diuron, I do this so that my tidings may be the more believed, and provided I reach Ireland, this piece of the mesh shall be offered by me on the altar of Armagh. 2.5 ounces was its weight when measured afterwards in Armagh. And then they heard a voice from the summit of yonder pillar, mighty and clear and distinct. But they knew not the tongue it spake, or the words it uttered. So I found this fascinating because a voice is uttered from this mystical pillar that they encounter, which could be like the Axis Mundi Brahman pillar. And the Axis Mundi Brahman, the Skamba, in the Shiva Puranic tradition, appears as the pillar with the linga of Shiva, and as itself, that linga is Shiva in his transcendent form. And of course, in the Shiva Purana and other versions, the linga pillar speaks to Brahma and Vishnu, and it speaks mystically. It speaks extremely mystically, of course. It says Aum, which is its name. It says I am called Aum, and all of that. And of course, Aum is a mystical syllable. It doesn't have clear meaning until it's explained, and Shiva does explain what it means to them, and so they understand his teaching there. But it speaks a mystical language as if vibrating out of the column, the pillar. So I find it fascinating that this pillar, they hear a voice from it, but it's some mysterious language, a mysterious tongue that they can't understand. So is this a variation? Is this from the same root as the Shiva Linga story? I think that's very possible, at least. We can't confirm that. We also, it's like there are several different ways you could look at it and see whether that seems compelling to you, because you can't really prove that or anything. But I do think you have a couple different versions of this base story, and then you have one of the versions where the pillar is there's speech coming from it, even though it is not understood. It's sort of a mysterious, mystical speech coming from the top of a silver pillar. Okay, so it's fascinating to find that as maybe that's going back to this absolute pillar mythos on a deep level that came through in the Shiva Purana and here. And if so, this reiterates the possibility that this column of silver could be the absolute pillar. And so that's why it's fascinating to see Enda directly connected so closely to it, because the ones who encounter the pillar in the Shiva version are the other aspects of the absolute, the other two Trimurti gods, but they are not, in that version, they are not Shiva himself, and they are not the absolute itself within the Shiva, within the Shaivite tradition. They're just the other sides of Shiva is higher. Shiva's placed higher in the Shaivite tradition, obviously, but they are still a Trimurti together as all faces of different aspects of the one. So that is interesting. Maybe like a slight shift occurred in the Irish variation of this, where it's like Enda and his brothers are aspects of one another, and they're encountering their own pillar nature, maybe, or something like that. That's like the only thing that really makes sense to me at this moment, because Enda should be the highest name equivalent to the pillar. But there are other possibilities where, something else was trying to be, they were trying to convey something else that I'm not understanding. So it's worth discussing about that, I think. There's other possibilities where Lochan, what if Lochan means Cuchulainn and or something, there's different ways like what if Enda is really Brahma, because he's the Brahman, but then he's Brahma, and Sylvester is Gwydion. No, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I don't actually think that's the strongest argument, but there's different ways where an argument could be made that they're like separate figures, like in the Indian version. But I still think, more evidence is pointing to some idea of them being on the same level, because Enda should be the highest name of all without parallel. And he has his two brothers there with him who have maybe Finn connected names. And then this pillar, okay, a lot of pieces there that are, like I said, we might not be able to pin them down, or at least right now, but we have to look at them. And so, why is it Ena? Why is the Birdlike the one leading the way? He's the lead brother, basically, of this story. And then his in the alternate variation, it's Moel Duin. Moel Duin is the bald, Duin could be, is it the fort, like a dun, like the dune, I mean, a fort, or does it have to do with dark or something? I don't really know. I think it looks more like the word for fort, fortress. So from there, you can think about that. I think we should look at Nevgan, because, like I said, once you touch on this name, the Birdlike, and how important it is in its positioning in the genealogies, it's like you have to investigate. You have to try to triangulate and compare and see what meanings you can derive from it. And when you start to do that, you realize there's all these possible associations. There's like a million different occurrences of birds, or bird-like, bird forms, bird disguises and cloaks within mythology, and they could all be relevant on one level or another. That's the trick, right? Is like some of these could be lower manifestations of that bird-like quality, but it all references back to the highest point, which is the bird-like nature. So putting those in order is tricky, but yeah, in Norse material, there are bird cloaks that several gods wear. I think Freya herself has a bird cloak, and then Thjatsi, does he steal hers, or does he have his own? I can't remember. Or rather, am I thinking of, I can't remember if Thjatsi has it. Thjatsi, of course, flies as a bird. Forgetting right now, but and then Volander, in the Volander Kviða, he I think wears a bird cloak to fly as well. There's different bird cloaks that appear, so these could have relevance. There is the eagle, the unnamed eagle in Yggdrasil that we touched on. And there's not much more I can say about the unknown eagle, except that it's said that he, in Snorri, it says Ratatoskr brings gossip between the eagle and the Nidhogger, the serpent at the base, and that this provokes both Nidhogger and the eagle. So my question is, if the eagle is the highest nature, why should he be provocable? He doesn't seem like he could be provocable if he's actually the highest birdlike. So that could be an error by Snorri, or a symbolic message by Snorri that, it's only to be taken metaphorically. Could be describing an interplay where is Nidhogger his other side, his own other side, and there's an interplay between them. I don't know. Or is the eagle like just a lower cosmic manifestation of the bird, like king of the birds within the world, like in the way we were talking about Garuda, maybe? Or, like, we always think that there's the eagle and the rooster perched on him. We always think, the eagle is bigger, stronger, more noble seeming bird than the rooster. Is it flipped? Is the rooster the one who's the higher observant mind in the tree?
Okay, so I have to look different one. Is there anything in here? Can I have one?
All right, thanks for your patience. And so back to what we were saying, if we can continue. We have the eagle and we have the rooster, so it's like something to think about, because Mercury was associated with the rooster, like we were saying. That's interesting. The rooster as like a herald and a watcher. He watches over to see the dawning of the day, even, and he is he's like vigilance and awakeness, you could say. And so, yeah, I don't know, is the rooster, but of course, there's complications with that. The rooster is described as something relating to wind. Yeah, Gulenkambi. So yeah, you can think about that. I don't know. It could be an error to compare those two birds with the two birds from the Rig Veda line, Vedahim. It's unfortunately there's not a ton of information, and how can we really be sure about that? But regardless, it's thought-provoking, and yeah, I think we can just deduce, and we can make our own interpretations of that. And there's something there. Obviously, they both are birds. They both are telling us something about the bird nature, let's say. Whether they themselves are the ultimate symbol of the absolute version, or if they are like that bird nature on the level of the world, and there's a higher ineffable bird nature that underpins both of them. Maybe I don't know, right? So something to think about. And then let's go to Nevgan. So Nevgan appears in Daderga's hostel. The story, let's see, the destruction of Daderga's hostel. Just one moment so I can pull it up. Okay. Or Nemglan. Sorry, I was mispronouncing that, I guess. I thought it was Nem. That's interesting. Nemglan, yeah. So forgive me for that mispronunciation, because it's Nevglan. Share this. Okay, so he's a supernatural figure who appears as a minor character in the destruction of Da Derga's hostile. He's called a birdman or king of the birds. His name appears to mean heavenly clean or perhaps unclean. They don't know, but can be either. And Nevglan appeared to the heroine in another story in the form of a bird and seduced her. Oh, no, that's the same story. Sorry. So, yeah, at the beginning of Da Derga's hostel, Nevglan appears to the mother of Conair Mor and fathers Conair on her, of course. So it's this sort of, it is a, what's interesting, right, is that it's similar to the story of like Bress's conception when Elaha appears to Eriu and fathers Bress, or when Surya, the sun god, appears to Kunti and fathers his own reincarnation, Karna, the sun incarnation. And of course, Bress is Karna. Bress is equivalent to Karna. I mean, Bress is the sun god, as that parallel supports and shows. What's interesting about that is like this is a similar story with Nevglan, the bird, and in the Rigvedic mystical symbolism in that hymn that we went through, the bird like really is like the nature of the sun. The sun is like the great bird. So that maybe there's a mystical connection there, where this trope it's being repeated in a similar way because Elaha is the higher sun, fathering the sun Bress. Nevglan is like the bird nature who is fathering the king, who then like embodies that, and the sun is I don't know. The sun can be like a second image of that same bird-like nature, I guess, in a way. There's some confluence. There's some overlap of these traits and stories. That's all I'm saying. Let's pop over here though, because okay. Go to Tara tonight. Okay. What happens is they're having the king dies at her shell, and then they're having a king choosing. They have to choose the next king, and to do that, there's a seer who eats a meal of bull broth. They have a bull feast. It's this king choosing sort of festival, and the seer, whosoever. Okay, who is it? Bull is used. One man. It just says one man. It's obviously some kind of seer would eats of the bull and drinks the broth, goes to sleep and has a vision of who the next king will be. This is happening elsewhere. So they go out. They send some men out to see what will happen, because he has a vision about a man stark naked passing along the road of Tara with a sling. That's what the seer. See, the bull feaster in his sleep beholds a man stark naked passing along the road of Tara with a stone in his sling. So okay, they send out some people to try to find that man who will be the king. And then it jumps over to where Conair is going about. Right, Conair is not present at that vision, obviously. And what happens is Conair sees a bunch of birds. Okay, wait. 4 men in chariots, Conair himself and his 3 brothers. Yeah, so it's confusing how these are connected, but this is separate because Conair and himself are leaving a different location, the plane of Liffey at their game. And they're going toward the bull feast, so they're separate, right? Something like that. Okay. Well, anyways, it's disjointed how this is being told, but you get the idea. They're somehow separate. I don't really understand if they're like there at the exact same time and then they go separate ways. But Conair doesn't know about this vision at that point because he goes and he sees some birds, great white speckled birds of unusual size and color and beauty. He pursues them until the horses were tired. The birds would go a spear cast before him and would not go any further. He got off his horse, alighted, and takes his sling for them out of his chariot. He goes after them until he was at the sea. The birds betake themselves to the wave. He went to them and overcame them. The birds quit their bird skins. They were wearing bird skins as if they had transformed completely into birds, but it was really a skin. That's what it kind of implies. It's like a shamanic transformation, more than they are merely birds, and turn upon him with spears and swords. But one of the birds protects him and addresses Conair, saying, I am Naveglon, king of thy father's birds. See, it doesn't say he's king of the birds, but it says he's king of his father's birds. So, yeah, that's less absolute than saying king of all birds or something. But nonetheless, it's important. And thou hast been forbidden to cast at birds, for here there is no one that should not be dear to thee because of his father or mother. And he's implying there that you have a taboo, Conair, against killing birds because there is no one that should not be dear to thee because of that. This is a coded way of saying birds are dear to you because of your father or mother, and that means your real father was a bird. Okay, because that's why Connor says, he's hinting at least. I don't know if he's fully communicating what happened, but because Naveglon is the bird man father, who is Conair's true father, as we said. And so here he encounters his son, and he's implying to him, you have a taboo on you to not kill birds because birds are dear to you because of your father or mother. Hint, hint. And then Conair says, till this day, says Conair, I knew not this. So maybe he got the message or not, but in any case, he understands there's a taboo to not do that. And then Naveglon tells him how to become the king, how to fulfill the prophecy. He says, go to Tara tonight, says Naveglon. 'Tis fittest for thee, a bull feast is there, and through it thou shalt be king, a man stark naked, who shall go at the end of the night along one of the roads of Tara, having a stone and a sling. 'Tis he shall be king. So Conair goes forth and does that, and they make him king even though he's young, essentially. And then Naveglon, let's see, a young generous king. Excellent, says the host. And he says, I will inquire of wise men that I myself be wise. Then he uttered all this as he had been taught by the man of the wave, who said this to him. So the man of the wave, Naveglon, also gave him several other taboos. And that's interesting, I think, because taboos are boundaries to not cross. So, in a sense, and laws, they're laws for an individual, they're mystical laws in a sense, defining, his nature and how to, what not to do. So I wonder if there's any relevance to how when Trevulniv arrives to Tara to give his message to Fintan, it is about how to make the divisions of the land. He's the source of divisions, and Dovnal Moelmud, he's the source of laws and divisions himself, as we saw. So there's always like a lawmaking quality, or being the ground that is the source of laws and divisions to the absolute. So I wonder if that has anything to do with Naveglon being the one who gives taboos. But it's a more wishy-washy, it's a more unclear thing, because taboos are told by other figures and arise in other ways too, so it doesn't tie him to anything. But nonetheless, he gives him a bunch of taboos, which Conair eventually breaks the taboos and of course meets his end because of that, or meets how that's what the rest of the story is about. So the question then is, Naveglon, is he like a symbol of the absolute itself embodied, or is he just like a lower king of some of the king's birds, king of the king's birds? But either way, like I said, even the lower king of the king's birds carries a piece of, or embodies, is a mirror reflecting that bird nature, I think, higher up. And so what that can tell us, at least, is that it can be an example of how the Gaels saw the bird nature reflecting, at least. It can tell us something about the bird nature. The bird nature has something to do with, prophecy. He obviously knows the prophecy. It's like he is the instrument. It's like he's the author of the prophecy almost. He knows it as much as the seer knows it, and he teaches it to his son Conair to fulfill. That connects him to prophecy. He's the source of taboos. He gives taboos, and he also ultimately is the kingmaker. He's the author of who's going to be king. So he's the source of the power of sovereignty, really. And on top of that, he's the father of the king who produces the king himself. I mean, Conair, the future king, through this story that we see with other gods doing, with Elaha in a similar way, or Surya, the sun himself. So in that way, he's in a role that reminds us of the sun itself. And the sun itself is the bird-like fire of the sky. And so those things kind of overlap, like we said. So yeah, in that sense, he is reflecting some qualities, I think, that are instructive to us about what the bird nature is, what it pertains to. It can pertain to prophecy, to the underlying power of sovereignty, what produces and chooses who the king will be. Maybe who is destined to be king is part of what the bird nature authors, or is a source of, the ground of, and then taboos, mystical boundaries, and the meaning and how those the meaning of them and how they work. Those could all be connected. And then obviously tying this particular hero to the bird-like within the tradition would be a way of asserting importance to Conair himself in the story. And that would have been understood more by people who understood the importance of the bird-like, of the birdman and the bird nature. Okay. It makes, and they're wearing bird skins, so they're clearly wearing something that reminds us of the druidic cloak, the Tweegen, if that's how it's pronounced, something like that, Tweegen, and that we went into last time. The druidic cloak, it's just like a shamanic sort of thing. I mean, shamanic is just a loose word. It's a druidic thing, really, and it shows this ultimate wielding of this ultimate power that, as we see, underlies sovereignty, underlies prophetic knowledge, taboos, other things like that. So maybe druids would see themselves as becoming like Nevgan, perhaps. That's a possibility. It also makes me wonder, right? His name is Nevglan. I keep saying Nevgan, but I apologize. Nevglan. Nevglan. We have the mysterious figure Neved, or however it's pronounced, meaning heaven, in the Book of Invasions. And I haven't been able to figure out who he is exactly, but he shares the root of his word with Nevglan. So that's interesting. And then Neved, one of his sons, is named something Glan, which we can also look up. One moment here. Okay. Well, I can't find the right one. So, what is it? There's Erglan. Maybe it was Erglan. Maybe that's all it was. That's not Gan. That's not who I'm thinking of. But okay. So, anyways, Beoan. There are 3 champions: Yarbonel the soothsayer, Nevid, and then Glan, son of Beoan, son of Starn, son of Nevid. So Glan is actually a great grandson, but he's there with the Nevedians. Okay, so it makes me wonder, like, is Glan? It's like Glan with a different prefix, and then you have Neved. Is Neved plus Glan? Is this suggesting to us a connection to Nevgan or not? So it makes me wonder. I don't know. But what's curious is that okay, one second. What's curious is that there are other instances of the tower encounter at sea, and these are prominently in like Nennius, the book. Like, I'm forgetting the name of the book. It's like has alternate versions of the invasions that we find in the Laura Gwala Erin. Okay. So let's see. Historia Bretonum. History Bretonum. And anyways, there's a couple of variations on this, and in one version, the sons of a soldier of Spain, which sounds like sons of Mil or sons of Breochan himself, leave Spain and encounter a tower at sea, right? And that's interesting because in this version by Nennius, that happens immediately after the wave of the Nevedians. And then the Nevedians basically go to Ireland briefly and then go back to Spain. So they originated in Spain in that version. And they go to Ireland, then back to Spain. And then from Spain, the people who encounter the tower, it's like a crystal tower at sea. And that reminds us of the encounters of the tower, of the pillar at sea that we just went into. Okay. Very curious how that connects. Because it has the Nevedians right before, in the wave right before that happening. But like they go to Ireland, then back to Spain, and then the people coming out of Spain encounter that tower. Curious. And then, let's see. And then the Nevedians themselves fight the battle against the Fomorians at the Tower of Conang, right? So, or Conand, rather. So this is, what's interesting is that I think Neved himself, he dies pretty early in this story, but as we saw with Parhalon, all of his children are relevant to what he is for Parhalon. Like they're all extensions, all of his people in that story are extensions of him, really. And of his, they're just names like of his powers. If you apply that thinking to Neved, it's possible to see, the encounter with the Tower of Conand as, something you can think about in relation to these tower encounters that we saw elsewhere. So the progeny of Neved were under great oppression after this time in Ireland at the hands of Moray, son of Dela, and of Conand, Febar, from whom the Tower of Conand named, which today is called Tor Innis, Ketna. In it was the great fleet of the Fomore. 2/3 of the progeny had to be brought. Wrath and sadness seized on the men of Ireland for the burden of the tax. They all went to fight against the Fomore. They had 3 champions: Semil, son of Yarbonel the soothsayer, son of Nevid; Erglan, as we said, son of Beon, son of Starn, son of Nevid; and then Fergus Redside, son of Nevid. 30,000 on sea, over 30,000 on land. They assaulted the tower. After the capture, the Moray, son of Dela, came upon with the crews of 70 ships, and they fell in a mutual slaughter. Then the sea came up over the people of Ireland, and not one of them fled from another. So severe was the battling. None escaped but one ship, in which there were 30 warriors. They went forth, parting from Ireland, fleeing from the sickness and taxation. So they're fleeing from sickness. It's a nice end of the wave, in a sense. Beithach died in Ireland of plague. His 10 wives survived him for a space of 23 years. Ebath and his son Bath went into the north of the world. Matach and Erglan and Ertach, the 3 sons of Beowen, went to Dobar and Dobar in the north of Alba. Semyon went into the land of the Greeks. They stole the pinnacles, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And then those people went back to Ireland. Gand, Ruri, and all of that. And then some people went and became the Britons, apparently. And these are the adventures. Okay, so the taking of the Conan's Tower. So as you can see here, like I said before, Ebath, his son Bath, went into the north of the world. They just disappear into the north of the world. But Bath is supposed to be the father of Enda in the one genealogical instance that just briefly tries to connect them. You can see in the actual story of the Nemedians, Bath has no named children. He just goes to the north of the world and vanishes. It's a seam. The Nemedians end with no Enda ever being born because it's been stitched together, I think. Enda, in that one instance, is said to be the son of Bath, but that's just trying to stitch the Tuatha Dé Danann together with the Nemedians. But what I'm saying here is, like, there's one angle you could take where, what if Nevid is another name of Enda himself, and so that whole generation is a repetition of, like, if you were to zoom in on Enda, do you see Nevid and his family and what they're doing? Is that what's happening? It's one possibility. The other possibility, there's a lot of other possibilities, like I said, the Dagda or Macgrania could be Nevid, or Nuada, or something else completely. We can look at some of his epithets, which are quite interesting. He's called Nevid with wrath, right? It says he used to effect victory without hazards, and Nevid with pride and intelligence. So he is wrathful, apparently, or he has wrath. He has fetters and valor. Fetters and valor. So fetters, it could be relevant to anybody, but there are connections of fetters to the Varuna type, the Mitra type, and also the Rudra type, if Odin is understood in that way. It's hard to tell if the fetters, are those Varunian fetters or Rudraic bindings? It's hard to say, right? Even Ptah is bound in mummy cloth. Okay, so fetters is kind of vague. But it's interesting and thought-provoking. Pride and intelligence. His troop is stately. That's pretty vague. There is a pestilence of fire over a death doom. I think this is just describing the pestilence of fire is just the war wrath of Nevid destroying all his enemies, I think, essentially, with fire, nature of fire included. So that's interesting. There's like a pestilence of fire. I mean, it's an interesting phrase. So pestilence of fire. It could be just like a kenning, I'm saying, of like war destruction, but it could be interesting on its own as well. And then he's called the Dark Lord of Slaughter, which is fascinating. His name means heaven, and he's called the Dark Lord of Slaughter. Like, that's just an incredible juxtaposition, I think. If that's who he's referring, if that's who this line is referring to, at least, I think so, because Nevid is the one who dies of plague, and this is talking about all of Nevid and his people fighting. Nevid is doing all this warring, and he's clearing the plains. He's digging up the ground and making forts. He makes forts. He clears these plains. He cleanses everything. He cleanses the region. And then some things there happen. Just different locations that he's working on there. The routs, those are his battle victories, many battle victories against the Fomorians, which he broke. It's clearly still talking about Nevid. And then it says, in the territory of Leathan of Muma, by Muma, the Dark Lord of Slaughter died of plague with the rude company of clean grass in Oilian Arda Nevid. So that makes it sound like that's the death of Nevid and that he's being called the Dark Lord of Slaughter. I looked up the Irish of this, and that's what it means. The wording is, it's pretty clear that it means Lord, like, what is it? Okay, anyways, it's basically Dark Lord of Slaughter, but Dark Slaughter Lord or something, you know what I mean? Might be more accurate or something like that, but Triath Air Temen. And of course, that's bad pronunciation, but here's how that's spelled. Triath Air Temen. Triach Air. Okay, so what does this tell us? I don't know. Could this be an image of Enda, or could this be an image of another Finn who's like a Dark Lord of Slaughter? Or does it lean us more toward him being like a Varuna or a Dagva or something completely different? What do you guys think? So those are kind of like the details we have. You can also, one thing people could do is look at the names that are associated with him, his sons and grandsons, and they tell us more information. And you can try to deduce something from there. But I think it's fascinating that his name means Nevid, heaven. That doesn't necessarily mean he's just like the sky, because it could be referring to the highest absolute as well as bird-like nature in like the Akhet. That's one possibility. I'm not saying that's the truth. I'm saying that's one possibility. Could be like the ether, the etheric level of the sky and the heavens. And so those are things we have to entertain. If it were like the Dark Lord of Slaughter and pestilence of fire and fetters and valor and victory and intelligence, you could spin those into looking like a Finn Rudra type description. But I also think you shouldn't stretch it and push it if there isn't enough evidence, which I don't really think there's enough. But yeah, why is his name Nevid and he has a grandson or great grandson Erglan? Those are two names close together that you don't see that elsewhere. And then you have Nevglan as the figure who like is a clear example of the bird-like in that other story. So that could be like a complete red herring and a wrong path to take. But there's the possibility that Nevglan heaven is like a destructive version of this like bird-like absolute that Enda is. In a sense that feels wrong. Because why should it be destructive in that way? But we also do see that Enda is a warrior in one phase of his story. So you can kind of go back and forth on this, and that's what I'm going to do for a while, is just go back and forth until something breaks, until something becomes more clear, I think. Okay, so that's a lot of fun to think about. Hopefully that was thought-provoking. And let's see what we can read about the Tuyen. So the Tuyen cloak, I recommend reading this article, The Bird Cloaks of Ireland, an investigation of the Tuyen or the Tuyen. It says here, how what kind of feathers it has: mallard feathers as well as swan feathers, or what does it say? Another kind of white bird, there's a couple different white birds they mention. They even say that there's a folk etymology of Tuyen, this name of this cloak, that the folk etymology or the etymology recorded within a certain glossary or something claimed that the word came from En, this word that we're concerned with, meaning bird, ein, twi, ein, but that's an incorrect. That's just a fabricated etymology. But regardless, you can see that, well, you can search for ein because it keeps coming up. Not okay, but like right here, tui en, covering of birds, ein for its skin of birds. It's not that it's surprising. Ein is just the word for bird, so obviously it's going to come up. But it is the word that is used often in describing this thing. Croichnib ein, or skin of birds. So obviously when somebody writes down Enda, the name Enda or ein in the Book of Invasions as a name of an ancestor, they know that it relates to this druidic cloak. They know the connections, whoever wrote this down. What's fascinating, though, that I want to touch on in this last part is just that we have other instances where other figures have bird nature, or they take on their bird nature, whatever. So in the Welsh story of Lleyllaw Gyffes, he turns into an eagle when he gets mortally wounded, and he flies to the top of the tree. He becomes the eagle in the top of the tree, actually, interestingly, but he's in a living dead state. He's like dropping carrion of some kind. He's dropping rotting his dead flesh off in a way. And he's like, he has to be healed. So he's like in a wounded state, it seems, but he's also gone to the other world in a sort of transcending sense. Also, he's gone to the top of the tree. That's interesting. Well, there's a translation issue here that there's an essay maybe I can flip over to, but Sweeney's Little Oratory. Here it is. I'll quickly pop over to this other essay. Sweeney's Little Oratory, World Tree Avian Transformation and Poetic Inspiration in the Irish Wildman Legend. And they talk about how Llay, when he turns into the bird, in the Welsh, there is a reading of the text where it can say this, nivith, nivit. This is the word nifith. It's the same word for nevith. Okay, so when Llay turns into the eagle, he flies to the top of the world tree, which is described as his sanctuary, using the word nivith right there. You see, N-Y-U-E-T, which they say right here is the same as nifeth, N-Y-F-E-D, which is the same as nevith, meaning, the name of, as we said. So the place, the location that the bird Llay goes to is at the top of the tree is his sanctuary place. It's like his little heaven, his little sacred place, and it's using the same word that is the name of Nevith. That's curious and interesting. The place the bird-like nature of Llay goes to is his own Nevith. That connects back to the name of Nevith, I think, as a possibility. Of course, it can also be a red herring. I recommend this article also because it goes into how Sweeney he has this story type where he goes mad, of course. He becomes gelt or wilt, which means crazy or wild, rather. And when he does so, though, he gains this bird-like nature. He is, it's like he sort of gets cursed, but also that curse gives him a sort of mad freedom of the bird, where he is like a wild shamanic figure. And he has this little oratory. He goes, it's similar to, well, in this essay, the author is comparing it to Llay's sanctuary that he has, his Nivith, and that, so when Sweeney goes flying about, there's some line here that can be compared. Okay, so apologize, I'm not remembering the exact details. I just recommend reading it for yourself, and you can kind of see, because it's interesting going back to the Svachanda. Svachanda can be compared to madness, the absolute freedom of the underlying nature of the absolute. It is like the madness of the wild man, of the seer, frenzy, inspiration. These are all kind of meet at a point of prophetic sight, all of that. And then, of course, the great tree from which Sweeney rises is Bila, the world tree. Okay, that's all interesting. He compares Sweeney to the shamanic figures. And metamorphosing into a bird, concerned with Sweeney and Saint Moling. The Saint's curse condemns Sweeney to a life of exile in the wilderness while in the form of a bird. Okay, just to put a point on that he is in the form of a bird. He's flying around, and even a Kaliak, a hag, tries to chase after him for a while, and he kind of outflies her, I think, right? I think that's what it says. She kind of... I'd have to read the exact details again. My feathers have grown. So he's essentially like also embodying the druid who wears the bird cloak, I would just like to say. And he has his little place he goes to at the top of the tree, which is like his quote-unquote little oratory. Oratory means like a place of prayer or singing or song for a monk, for them in a monastery or church, an oratory, right? So place of oratorio, what is that? I'm not sure the exact definition, but it has to do with prayer and having, like a place in a church or monastery. So that's like a little sanctuary. And as we saw, it can be identified with the word nevid, or nefid in the Welsh. Okay. I'm just going to wrap this up now. So these are my main points. Bar Eden. Okay. It's interesting that Goban, the Goan Sur, Goan, Govnew, the great smith, creates his little house that he lives in, I guess, his little oratory. That's interesting. There are indications that Enda... Well, there's something... Another scholar argued that Enda had a connection to this Goban as well, in a place name. It wasn't very strong, but it was something to consider. Because I always wonder if the Goban Sur could be a face of Breochan as a craftsman builder, because Ptah and Breochan are the ultimate craftsmen. Okay, so that power of crafting clearly reflects into the Goban Sur, but it's just hard to tell what level this Goban Sur, whatever it's pronounced, is at. What level is that? I don't know. And then Sweeney, of course, is like, you can compare to the wood dweller, Sylvester, Gwydion, Merlin, because there are at least two figures in Welsh material which appear to be variants of Gwydion who have the title Wilt, which is the same as Gelt, the wild. Okay, and that is Merlin Wilt. So the version of Merlin who's called Merlin the Wild, he goes mad in a battle just like Sweeney does, and goes into the wilderness and gains a sort of prophetic power of madness from this madness deriving from it. And So that's and Merlin has very similar powers to Gwydion and has a similar relation to King Arthur that Gwydion has to Llay as a like fostering father or mentor type of wizard. Does sort of like illusion magic in a similar way. And then, of course, Killider, Wilt in the story of Gwyn and Gwythyr. Killider the Wild, is the one who is forced to eat the heart of his father, Nathan, and that is mythically the parallel of when Pushan is forced to eat the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is identifiable with Vishnu and also Prajapati in that story. So it's like eating the heart of Vishnu, and Nuthan is Vishnu. So in comparative mythology terms, those things work, is what I'm saying. So Killider the Wild, Killider Wilt equals Pushan in that myth, and Merlin equals Pushan equals Gwydion. So that means that Sweeney in this tradition is overlapping with those wild. He's obviously overlapping with Merlin in the body of lore. So in that sense, Sweeney is, he falls into that tradition. He has overlap with the Gwydion type and the Merlin type, and this is like a branch of the Finn type. It's an aspect of the Finn type or the Gwyn type on a higher level that we've explored elsewhere. And that's interesting because, again, he's the one gaining the bird-like nature. It says, and then I like the conclusion of this essay, which maybe we can conclude with. So he says, on the level of interpretation, Sweeney's oratory is a metaphorical construct, a house of poetry in which the madman makes contact with the otherworldly forces that inform his creative art. His transformation into avian form facilitates this divine contact in a way that is typologically similar to the mantic techniques of modern shamans. The poet also uses language familiar to the monastic culture in which he lives to reformulate little understood pre-Christian concepts about poetic initiation into a work which still beautifully expresses the power of the Gelt, the madman, the wild man's profound relationship with nature and the ineffable. So ineffable, that's what he is touching upon, the absolute, when he goes into this bird-like nature. Okay, so hopefully that's illustrative or interesting in some way, and you can kind of see the process of how we have to kind of dig out the associations that are most relevant to help us illuminate what the bird-like nature is and how it can be understood and integrated into our thinking about this. Because I think it's our task to try to clarify what is the bird like, and to understand why it really is so important, and not just slightly important, but extremely important. And so, even though some of this is open-ended and slightly painstaking to go through, it also can be worthwhile if you keep pushing through. So, okay, all right, thanks. Yes, Pan is the Gwydion Pushanic type. I agree. So that's what I think. So any other thoughts before I go? I think you've reached the very end, or rather the beginning of the absolute. I do think so. I think, I would like to say, I think it's very clear, because we have these two examples, that Ain and Enda are like the end, the peak, the apex of the absolute. But it leaves open what I'm saying here is, like, I think Nevid, it's an open possibility whether Nevid is another instance of Enda. And like, if you zoom in on Enda, you see like what Nevid is doing, maybe. So that's like more material about him, maybe. But that could be wrong as well. So I want to leave that. It could be a red herring, like I've said. We need to investigate that. Okay, and then I think we've reached the end. But I think there's more you can read about how the Druids operated. I wanted to touch on the Druids clearly really liked sensory deprivation things. Like they would train and they would give inspired poetry by sleeping or by living going into a dark hut, a completely darkened hut, and doing these things like certain mystical techniques, imhas, foroshnai, and these other things. But they would use darkness, cutting off their senses, to achieve poetic inspiration, and that is sensory deprivation. That reminds me of cutting oneself free from limitations and becoming sort of like the bird. Like you can think of how sensory deprivation makes you feel like flying, and it cuts you off from your senses in a way. So I think that's part of what they were doing. Inducing the poetic trance was like inducing a feeling of being like the bird. And there's other ways they probably did that. There's another known technique that's described of a druid. I think it's a bull again, maybe it's some kind of animal like a bull, which they would cut open and they would sleep inside of a carcass or of just a bull of some kind. They would, or not sleep, rather, they would stay in this bull overnight to induce, whether it was dreams, like in the story we just read, where they ate the bull, or if they were awake at certain times having visions. I'm not sure how that worked, but that's clearly like another sensory deprivation, sort of weird way of inducing a trait. And you could see in that story where they eat the bull, they're directly tying that to Nevglan, the bird-like one, because he's like the source of that. So you can see this intertwining of this like bull ritual thing with the bird-like prophetic nature. Those things are sort of being intertwined, I think. So that could tie back to these things where they eat weird foods. They bite the cat food, eat the cat food in the Imhas Foroshnai story. Finn bites his finger. There's different techniques of weird things to induce this separation. But yeah, I think there are different traits. There are different stories about ancient techniques like this. Incubation in the Greek tradition, incubation techniques, which I can't even touch on. And then there's things in Platonism where the idea is for the soul to regain its wings, to fly back to the absolute. And that is part of what theurgy itself is. So this involves what theurgy is, and sensory deprivation, dream meditations, and all these kinds of techniques that could have been relevant to what the Druids were doing and other people. So I do think they had all these mystical techniques that we've kind of like lost exactly what they were doing, but there are traces of them, and we can kind of try to investigate that. And then, like I said, I think there's a lot we can investigate with how the Indians also. There's a lot of material with how the Indians treated the relation of the soul of the Atman to the Brahman, and how the bird-like nature kind of connects to that, and how things like the Svachanda Bhairava nature is pertinent to that as well. And ultimately, Enda, the monk in his oratory, or Sweeney in his oratory, as this image of the bald, silent mystic, that does tie back to like Shiva meditating. Like, it's like this meditating concept, whether it's sensory deprivation in the dark or meditating on the peak of the mountain. Those things are all tied together and relevant and related to each other. Okay. All right. I got to go. And thanks for listening. I really appreciate people investigating this stuff. It's crazy because this is like, to me, this is like a rare discovery that's like amazing and fascinating, but it also takes a ton of layers that are boring to most people to sift through, and also a lot of speculation that can be annoying to a lot of people. So on the one hand, I want to share. I think so many people should be interested in what Enda is, but on the other hand, it's extremely difficult to get the golden nugget out of this. And so I appreciate everyone for taking the time who has listened to this, and investigate it more for yourself, and spread the word if you would like about Enda, about the bird-like, because it's the bird-like. It's this really cool, fascinating apex of the absolute thing to have as a point of further study that we can kind of dig into. All right, thank you, and have a great day, everyone.